Arguably the biggest loss in the jump to flat-screen HDTVs was the arcade light gun. Sure, shooters are probably better than ever nowadays, but sometimes you just can't beat the feeling of aiming right at your screen and taking down zombies, ducks, or hell, maybe even zombie ducks. There have been several attempts in recent years to recapture the magic of the light gun on modern hardware, most recently with 2019's Mars made by the folks over at PDP for both the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. With proprietary hardware and a couple games custom built for it, how well does the PDP Mars work, and does it justify the $100 price tag? Today on The Golden Bolt, we're gonna find out just that. First things first, I want to make it clear that PDP sent me all of what you'll be seeing in this video for review purposes. That includes the $100 Mars starter kit, as you can see behind me, which was the Voyage of the Dead variety. That includes that game, Voyage of the Dead, as well as a Mars IR camera and one Light-Con controller. They also sent me a copy of Qbits Quest, the second made for Mars game, as well as 2 more Light-Con controllers. I'm not sure why they sent me 3 instead of, 2 or 4, but I appreciate it because now I'm 3/4 of the way to my Bayonetta cosplay. As always, none of this will affect my review. I just want to make sure I disclose it because it's always good to do so, especially because I legally and ethically have to. So, I told you so. With that out of the way, I'd like to tackle the Mars hardware first. All you have to do to set this system up is plug the USB camera into your console, angle it so that it can detect all 4 corners of your TV screen, and then load up the game. That's it. From there, the camera calibrates itself by matching the 2 sets of blinking Mars logos on the screen. Surprisingly, you don't have to set the camera up directly in front of the TV. Any angle or height will do. Even better, the USB cord's wire is about 10 feet long, meaning that you have a decent bit of space to work with depending on your gaming setup. The first time I set up Mars, it synced by itself instantly. However, don't get your hopes up because that wasn't the case pretty much any other time I used it. Both the user guide and the setup tutorial available on PDP's YouTube channel imply that if the camera doesn't sync by itself, you should adjust it slightly and gradually until the Mars logos on the screen sync up properly. In practice, if you move the camera even the tiniest bit, the logo flies across the screen at seemingly random sizes and intervals, making it all but impossible to manually sync this thing. On 4 separate occasions, I rearranged my desk and my console setup. I lined the camera directly in front of the TV. I tilted my TV. I turned off every light so the TV wouldn't have a smidge of glare. I did just about everything I could do, and it just refused to work. Then, again, in all 4 situations, I can't make this up, when I'd exhausted every possible option and when I was looking at the more detailed user guide sent to reviewers and members of the press, the camera would suddenly click and everything would sync as if I hadn't just spent half an hour trying to set the damn thing up. For whatever reason, the only time that it would take less than 20 minutes to set the camera up was when it was sitting precariously on the arm of my chair, but hey, if it works, it works. Outside of that early frustration though, Mars works just about perfectly, and that's surprising, again, given how long it can take to set up. I was able to play for up to 2 to 3 hours in a single sitting without the light cons desyncing while playing co-op with multiple light cons at once. It's a strong show of confidence when my arms start to tire from holding the guns up before I have to worry about the game losing calibration. Don't get me wrong, there were a couple occasions where my on-screen reticle would end up maybe 5 to 10 pixels to the left of where I was actually aiming, but I chalked that up more to the angle that I was playing at since, again, I had to set my chair in the center of my room and precariously place the camera on the chair's arm. Usually the calibration was easy to fix thankfully, but I would still fault the system for having such big setup issues that dealing with uncalibrated aiming might be preferable to spending half an hour waiting for the camera to work. Moving on to the Mars Light-Con, this is a very well designed peripheral, I've gotta say. It features 3 buttons, obviously a trigger as you'd expect, there's a pump button here on the front barrel, and a back hammer button, which can be used either as a reload button or to switch to another gun, depending on the game it can change here or there. There's a good sense of weight to it, and it feels very comfortable to hold, at least early on. We'll get into that in a moment. And there's also a little iron sight of sorts that you can aim down if you wish to. I recommend doing that to make sure your gun is calibrated correctly, but if you prefer to hold it like this, that also works. It's just kind of not super comfortable to hold long term. And speaking of that, perhaps they could have made it a little bit lighter. It's very comfortable at first, but if you're playing for like an hour or 2 hours or maybe even more, It kind of gets a little bit uncomfortable to keep holding it up constantly. We'll talk about that a little bit more with Voyage of the Dead, though. Really, the only issue I have, again, is with the syncing. Usually they'd sync up just fine, but one of my light cons, for whatever reason, never liked to properly sync, so I barely used it. Again, if you put syncing issues aside though, the hardware is impeccable. You couldn't ask for a more accurate system in a proper arcade. Just keep in mind that you'll also need 2 AA batteries for each light con you pick up. I really just wish the setup was a bit simpler, as the user guide, the YouTube guide, and the reviewer guide all glossed over in different ways how to actually set the damn thing up. There's simply no troubleshooting process when it comes to Mars. It feels very much like the technical designers are the ones that wrote the guides for the end user, and that usually doesn't go over well, as we clearly see here. If not for the setup issues, I could almost recommend Mars on the hardware alone. It's surprisingly good at capturing the classic light gun feel. And speaking of that feel, onto the games. Currently there are 3 games compatible with Mars, each listed at $20. 2 of these games are custom made for the hardware, and 1, Big Buck Hunter Arcade, is retrofitted onto an already available release. This is the game that I didn't receive with my press kit, and I'm actually thankful for that, as I had absolutely no interest in Big Buck Hunter to begin with. See, this game has never actually been that good. It's just kind of a game that was tossed together to grab some stray quarters from rednecks, and from what I've gathered, it more or less doesn't work well with the Mars integration, or really without it for that matter. If anything, Big Buck Hunter being compatible with Mars hurts the system more than it helps it. Seeing this on the list of games when there are only 3 games? Yeah, that's not a good sign. Next up is Qbits Quest, a cute little hybrid of the traditional auto-scrolling light gun shooter and also a platformer. As you can already tell, this game doesn't look good at all. Again, not a good sign. Even worse, the frame rate frequently dips below the already low bar of 30 frames per second, there's often slowdown, there's a myriad of graphical bugs, it's just not a pretty game. It does come with an absurdly funky Fitnessgram Pacer Test soundtrack though, so I guess it evens out. Thankfully, Qbits Quest works far better than it looks. The aiming is fairly accurate here, although thanks to the tiny on-screen reticle, you essentially have to keep firing at all times to see where you're aiming, thus lowering your accuracy and final score. By the way, that reticle is turned off by default for no good reason, and there's a much larger one on screen during the game's cutscenes that you can't access anywhere else except for those cutscenes. Just why? It can be really hard to see with all that's going on screen. You would think that the first thing on the to-do list with this kind of game would be to add multiple visual options, but hey, what do I know? Anyway, in this game's 5-mission story mode, you'll help guide this robotic dog Qbit through swaths of enemies in order to save the world from a dangerous military AI. With a few exceptions, Qbit will usually mosey through the stages regardless of what you do, even if that means that it's casually walking through a barrage of enemy fire. The trigger, as you'd expect, is used to shoot enemies, and the hammer button triggers Qbit's jump. More often than not, the levels are side-scrolling affairs, with hidden upgrades, optional objectives, and other little goodies spread throughout the backdrop. Occasionally, the game jumps more into the third dimension, and when it does, it's pretty bad. There's one section near the end of the game where Qbit's flying in 3D through a wormhole and grabbing 8 data keys, and with the tiny reticle, the bad moving textures, and the awful perspective, it's really hard to see where you're guiding Qbit. Really, the final 2 missions just suck all around. There's a section where Qbit's in a bubble and you have to shoot the back of the bubble to move forward, with obstacles all around that will pop the bubble and make you start that whole section over. A section in space where you jump between gravity wells hoping that you don't careen into space and start the whole section over. A spot where Qbit's being dragged through the stage by robots and you have to keep shooting at the floor to keep it active so Qbit doesn't fall through. It's all maddening, and even though the game's only an hour long tops, you'll want it to be over with much sooner. Don't get me wrong, the game's really fun for those first couple of levels where you're just shooting and occasionally jumping, but the more that Qbits Quest tries to do, the worse it gets. The mini-games are where Qbits Quest is its most fun, and that's still not really saying a ton. Just about all of these are spins on popular games like Asteroids, Missile Command, Flappy Bird, and yes, of course, Duck Hunt, and they're all cute little time wasters that you'd expect to see packed in on the Wii back in 2007. For those keeping score, it's 2020 and Mars came out last year. I will say I didn't expect to like the Flappy Bird one most of them all, but there's a really fun loop to timing your jumps while also shooting at incoming obstacles. Beyond that one though, with names like Whistle Command, the minigames are better names than they are actual games. Thankfully, the final game, Voyage of the Dead, is much better. This game's a pretty shameless House of the Dead clone with the wrinkle that we're put on an infected cruise ship. This setting is super fun and allows for some great set pieces through the game's 1 to 2 hour story mode. Plus, Voyage of the Dead simply runs better than Qbits Quest does, with fewer visual bugs and a more satisfying kick to the gameplay. For example, hitting zombies in the head will pop that head clean off, which goes a long way towards making the aiming feel more precise. Really, the only time I had any graphical issues was with one particular boss who, I'm not kidding, is named Zombie God. Every time he cloned himself, the game would completely freeze for about 2 full seconds, and he clones himself a lot. So much so that I kept fearing the game crashed on me during this fight. On this voyage, you can pick from 8 different playable characters, each of whom have their own different specialty weapon, a full level progression, and a couple of incredibly repetitive quips. Seriously, these characters just don't shut up. Every time you reload, the same line comes out every single time. It's honestly kind of funny to me, but if I wasn't laughing at it, I would absolutely hate it. These characters range from a New York detective, to a fisherman, to a shaman, to a mad scientist that totally isn't Doc Brown from Back to the Future, and of course, several more. As you progress through the levels, you'll gain experience and level up your character of choice, allowing you to take on new perks specific to that character. It's a lot more involved than I would have expected at first, and honestly, I really enjoy that about this game. Voyage of the Dead is super fun and super replayable, especially with friends. And trust me, you'll want to bring along some friends because it's an absolutely brutal game. If you're playing solo and you die once, it's game over. No checkpoints, no starting over from that mission, you're starting the entire game over, and every character is reset back to level 1 every time. Remember when I said a moment ago that I was afraid the game kept crashing on me when fighting Zombie God? Yeah, I was mostly afraid of starting the game from square one yet again. By myself, I only got about a third of the way through the game before I would hit a wall and have to start fresh. In co-op though, my buddy and I were able to beat the game and it was an absolute blast. I really wish there was a chapter select of some sort, even if you didn't get the trophy for truly beating Voyage of the Dead unless you did it in one run. After all, if you get the bundle that includes this game, you're spending $100 on a game that's going to be a pain to get through unless you fork over an extra $30 for a second controller just to bring a friend along. It's a fun game, but it's clearly not $130 fun. A chapter select would also help players to put the light cons down and take a break instead of hammering at the trigger for 2 straight hours. I don't care who you are, that's gonna get tiring eventually, and in a world where Nintendo warns you every 45 seconds to take a break and go outside, I don't get how 2 hours of consecutive play on these things can scrape by the focus testers without so much as a peep. There are a couple smaller issues I have on top of this. For one, yet again, the reticle is a problem. Thankfully, it's a little bit better this time, as it's now a laser sight colored based on what player number you are. Player 1 is red, 2 is blue, and so on. However, when a lot's going on, especially in co-op, it's hard to see where you're actually aiming unless you're the type of player that aims down your fake sight at all times and hopes that the tracking is accurate. It's even more frustrating because yet again, the on-screen cursor during cutscenes is larger than what you ever get to play with. Another complaint I have is that you can only hold one regular weapon at a time. Shooting any weapon you see lying around, either intentionally or otherwise, replaces your main weapon until you run out of ammo with that new one, and then it's back to your pistol. I really wish I could hold all, or at least more than one of my weapons at once and swap between them at will. It'd go a good way towards cracking that difficulty down a notch. Moreover, you don't get your character's specialty weapon until the 3rd mission, and it took me a good few solo runs to even get that far. I know it's meant to be an old-school arcade-styled game, but thanks to how much is on screen and how hard it is to see where you're shooting, you might have to play through the first 20 minutes several times to get past the bloater enemies, and I think that's a bit much. Once you get that special weapon though, the game really opens up. Just to name a few examples, the scientist has a freeze ray that'll turn enemies into blocks of ice, the detective has a 44 Magnum that just about one-shots everything, and the fisherman has a harpoon that does just about the same thing. Having these guns available from the start would go a long way to bringing the magic of Voyage of the Dead out much sooner. even with all of this in mind, I had a ton of fun with Voyage of the Dead's main story, and I'm actually excited to go back and play it again soon. The minigames, on the other hand, just plain suck, and sadly this is where you acquire the 4 unlockable characters, which means you'll have to suffer through most of these minigames at least once. There's a good variety of minigames, from bad pinball to alien UFO skeet shooting except your gun has a huge delay when firing, to playing golf by kicking a zombie's head off. I just wish they were fun. The only one of these that I found enjoyable was naturally the Endless Horde mode. Also, why does every menu in this game use regular controls? Wouldn't this be like the perfect time to highlight how good your light gun aiming is in a controlled setting instead of, I don't know, cycling slowly through each menu option with the back button? Now sure, some of these might be a bit nitpicky, and I would totally accept them in a $20 game by itself, but when that $20 game costs $100 to play, I expect a higher level of quality from the software. So with all of this info in mind, the golden question is, do I recommend Mars? No, I can't say I do, not unless you're a light gun fiend with some extra money to spend. If PDP could just get those initial syncing issues knocked out, the hardware is just fantastic. In my experience, it's the most accurate attempt yet at capturing that precise, old-school light gun feel. But that solid hardware is betrayed by the limited software library. I think Voyage of the Dead is incredibly fun, easily the star of the show here, but it alone can't justify the price tag, especially since I'd argue you need 2 or more players to really beat it and have a ton of fun with it, which again is another $30 that you've got to toss for another controller each. If there were any indication of more Mars-compatible games on the way, this would probably be a different story. Most of the issues I experienced have pretty simple fixes, and literally any continued support at all would be close enough to instill confidence in the purchase. I, for one, would love to see one of the official House of the Dead games come to Mars, or a Time Crisis remaster, or anything really, because 3 games just isn't gonna cut it. After all, Mars isn't just a peripheral, it's its own system, and as it stands, assuming that no other games come in the next few months, I would be surprised if the Mars bundles don't drop to half price pretty soon. And I've gotta say, at $50, I think I would be far more likely to recommend Mars to more people. I truly hope that more games are on the way, and that the issues I've found can be ironed out soon. It would just be a shame to see this system fall short of its potential. Which light gun games would you like to see find new life on Mars? Let me know down in the comments below. As always, thank you very much for watching, sharing, subscribing, and supporting. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna try finding out if Persona 3 is real. I've always been kinda curious. Until next time, everybody, stay golden. This video was made possible in part thanks to the generous support of these Patreon backers. If you'd like to see your name on this list, you can do so by supporting the channel at patreon.com/thegoldenbolt. Thank you.